Welcome to Brain Upgrade. What if I told you that the most confusing, painful, and uncertain season of your life isn't a sign that you're falling behind? It's a biological signal that you're evolving. Your brain changes before your life does, before confidence appears, before success becomes visible, and before the best chapter of your life begins. Your nervous system goes through a period of discomfort, uncertainty, and adaptation. Stay with me until the end, because once you understand what's really happening inside your brain, you'll never look at difficult seasons the same way again. Let's begin. Most people assume that when life suddenly becomes uncomfortable, something has gone wrong. They interpret uncertainty as failure, stress as weakness, and resistance as a signal to stop. But if we examine what actually happens inside the nervous system during periods of meaningful growth, we see a very different picture. The brain is not designed to remain static. It is designed to adapt. An adaptation almost always begins with a temporary period of instability. One of the primary jobs of your brain is prediction. Every second of the day, your nervous system is creating models of what it expects to happen next. These predictions help you conserve energy, react quickly, and navigate your environment efficiently. The more familiar your routines become, the less energy your brain has to spend processing them. This is why habits eventually feel automatic. They require fewer neural resources because the circuits responsible for those behaviors have become stronger through repetition.
Now imagine introducing a completely new challenge into your life. It could be starting a business, changing careers, ending an unhealthy relationship, learning a difficult skill, or committing to a demanding fitness routine. Suddenly, your brain is forced to operate without reliable predictions. The old neural pathways no longer provide accurate guidance, while the new pathways have not yet been established. This creates what many people experience as discomfort, confusion, or self-doubt. In reality, your nervous system is entering a state where change becomes possible.
This process is closely tied to neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to reorganize itself by forming and strengthening new neural connections. Neuroplasticity is not something that happens only during childhood. Healthy adult brains retain the capacity to change throughout life. However, that change usually requires focused attention, repeated effort, and exposure to manageable levels of challenge. Without challenge, there is very little reason for the brain to modify its existing circuitry. An important point that often gets overlooked is that moderate stress plays a useful biological role. When you encounter a challenge that stretches your current abilities but does not overwhelm you completely, your brain releases chemicals that increase alertness and improve your capacity to learn. This heightened state of attention allows neurons that fire together repeatedly to strengthen their connections. Over time, behaviors that once demanded tremendous effort begin to feel increasingly natural. What initially felt uncomfortable gradually becomes part of your identity. This explains why many people experience emotional resistance precisely when they begin moving toward meaningful goals. The resistance is not necessarily proof that they are incapable. More often, it reflects the nervous system attempting to conserve familiar patterns. From an evolutionary perspective, familiar environments were generally safer than unknown ones. As a result, your brain naturally favors predictability, even when those predictable patterns no longer serve your long-term growth. This also explains why fear frequently appears before progress. The emotional centers of the brain respond strongly to uncertainty, because uncertainty represents incomplete information. Your brain cannot fully predict the outcome, so it temporarily increases vigilance. You may notice racing thoughts, increased self-criticism, or the urge to return to familiar routines. These reactions are completely understandable from a biological perspective. They are not evidence that you should abandon the process. They are evidence that your nervous system is actively updating its internal models. Another important factor involves attention. What you repeatedly focus on influences which neural pathways become stronger. If every challenge becomes evidence that you're failing, your brain becomes increasingly efficient at producing thoughts of defeat whenever stress appears. On the other hand, if you consistently interpret temporary discomfort as part of the learning process, you reinforce neural networks associated with persistence and adaptive problem solving. This is not simply positive thinking. It reflects the way repeated patterns of thought and behavior shape the architecture of the brain over time. Recovery is equally important. The brain does not build stronger neural connections only during periods of intense effort. Many of the biological processes involved in learning continue during periods of rest and especially during high-quality sleep. Sleep supports memory consolidation, allowing newly formed neural pathways to become more stable. This means that growth depends on both deliberate challenge and adequate recovery. Ignoring either side of that equation limits your capacity for long-term adaptation. It's also worth recognizing that adaptation rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. Most neural changes occur gradually through repeated experiences. Day by day, the improvements may seem almost invisible, but weeks or months later, you often realize that situations which once triggered anxiety now feel manageable. Conversations that once intimidated you become routine. Decisions that once seemed overwhelming become clearer. This gradual shift reflects thousands of small biological changes accumulating beneath conscious awareness. When people describe the period before a major breakthrough as feeling chaotic or uncertain, they're often describing this transition between an old neural framework and a new one. The discomfort isn't necessarily a sign that life is falling apart. It may indicate that your brain is reorganizing itself in response to demands it has never faced before. While that process is rarely comfortable, it is one of the defining characteristics of meaningful growth. The individuals who eventually experience lasting transformation are often not those who avoid discomfort, but those who understand that temporary instability is frequently the price the nervous system pays for developing greater capability, resilience, and adaptability. One of the most overlooked aspects of personal growth is that meaningful change rarely begins with acquiring something new. More often, it begins with letting go of something old. Before your behaviors change consistently, before your confidence becomes visible, and before other people notice any difference, your identity starts to shift. This process can feel surprisingly uncomfortable because the brain has a strong preference for maintaining familiar patterns, even when those patterns no longer support the life you want. Identity is not a single location in the brain. It emerges from networks that integrate your memories, habits, emotional experiences, beliefs, and predictions about who you are. Every repeated behavior strengthens these networks. If you've spent years seeing yourself as someone who procrastinates, avoids difficult conversations, doubts your abilities, or seeks approval from others, those patterns become deeply embedded through repetition. The brain becomes efficient at producing the same thoughts, emotions, and behaviors because it has practiced them thousands of times. This efficiency is one of the remarkable features of the nervous system. The brain is constantly trying to conserve energy. Whenever a behavior becomes predictable, it requires less conscious effort. That's why habits often feel automatic. Whether those habits are beneficial or harmful, the brain treats familiarity as valuable because predictable behaviors reduce cognitive demand. From a biological standpoint, the nervous system doesn't automatically distinguish between healthy and unhealthy routines. It prioritizes what has been repeated consistently. Now consider what happens when you decide to become a different version of yourself. Perhaps you commit to exercising every morning, speaking with greater confidence, building a business, improving your relationships, or developing emotional discipline. Initially, these new behaviors feel unnatural. They demand attention, energy, and conscious control because the neural pathways supporting them are still relatively weak. At the same time, the older pathways remain highly efficient, constantly encouraging you to return to familiar behaviors. This internal conflict is often misunderstood. Many people interpret it as a lack of motivation or evidence that they are incapable of changing. In reality, it's exactly what we would expect from a brain undergoing adaptation. The nervous system is balancing two competing systems, one representing your established identity and another representing the person you are becoming. During this period, it is entirely normal to feel inconsistent. An important principle from neuroscience is that neurons that fire together repeatedly strengthen their connections over time. This means your identity is shaped less by isolated moments of inspiration and more by repeated behaviors. Every time you act in alignment with your future self, even when it feels uncomfortable, you provide evidence to your brain that this new pattern deserves reinforcement. Initially, these changes are subtle, but with repetition, the underlying neural circuits become increasingly stable. Another fascinating aspect of identity change involves prediction. The brain continuously generates expectations about your future behavior based on your past experiences. If you've consistently avoided challenges for years, your brain predicts that you'll continue avoiding them. When you suddenly act differently, those predictions are violated. This creates what neuroscientists sometimes refer to as a prediction error. While prediction errors require additional energy to process, they also provide one of the strongest signals for learning and updating neural models. This helps explain why stepping outside your comfort zone often feels mentally exhausting. Your brain is processing information that doesn't fit its existing expectations. It's rewriting internal models that may have remained unchanged for years. That process demands significant cognitive resources, which is why periods of growth can feel mentally draining even when they are deeply rewarding. Relationships often become part of this transition as well. Human beings are highly social, and our brains are remarkably sensitive to social feedback. People around you become accustomed to a particular version of who you are. As your behaviors begin to change, others may consciously or unconsciously encourage you to return to familiar patterns because predictability creates stability within social groups. This doesn't necessarily mean they want you to fail. It often reflects the natural tendency of social systems to resist change. This is why personal growth sometimes requires adjusting the environments you spend time in. The brain constantly responds to cues from the surrounding environment. If every cue reinforces old habits, maintaining new behaviors becomes significantly more difficult. On the other hand, environments that support your desired behaviors reduce the amount of willpower required to sustain them. Small changes, such as modifying your workspace, altering your daily routine, or surrounding yourself with people who model the behaviors you value, can dramatically increase the likelihood that new neural pathways become permanent. It's equally important to understand that identity change is rarely linear. Some days you'll feel confident and focused, other days you'll notice yourself slipping back into familiar habits. This doesn't mean you've lost progress. Neural pathways strengthen gradually through repetition, and occasional setbacks are part of the biological process of learning. What matters most is returning to the behavior consistently enough that the new pathway becomes stronger than the old one. Over time, something remarkable begins to happen. The actions that once required discipline start requiring less effort. Waking up early becomes automatic. Exercising becomes part of your routine rather than a daily decision. Speaking confidently feels natural instead of forced. Managing stress becomes more intuitive. These changes occur because repeated practice has physically altered the efficiency of the underlying neural circuits. Eventually, the person you once hoped to become no longer feels like a future version of yourself. It becomes your present identity. What once demanded constant motivation now reflects who you are. From the outside, people may describe this as a dramatic transformation. But beneath the surface, it is the result of countless repetitions, gradual neural adaptation, and the willingness to tolerate temporary discomfort while the brain built an entirely new set of patterns capable of supporting a different life. One of the most misleading aspects of personal development is that real progress often feels invisible while it is happening. We naturally expect improvement to be obvious. We assume that if we're growing, we'll feel more confident every day, perform better every week, and see immediate results from our efforts. But the nervous system doesn't operate that way. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of meaningful adaptation is that the internal changes begin long before the external results become visible. The brain is constantly adjusting to the demands placed upon it. Every time you practice a new skill, challenge an old belief, or persist through discomfort, billions of neurons communicate through electrical and chemical signals. Initially, these changes are incredibly small. They occur at the level of individual synapses, the tiny junctions where neurons exchange information. Each repetition slightly strengthens some connections while weakening others. None of these individual changes are dramatic on their own, but collectively they create lasting transformation over time. This gradual process explains why so many people abandon meaningful goals too early. They judge progress based on immediate outcomes instead of biological adaptation. If they don't see visible improvements within a few days or weeks, they assume nothing is happening. Meanwhile, beneath conscious awareness, the nervous system is actively reorganizing itself. Neural pathways are becoming more efficient, predictions are being updated, and the brain is learning how to respond more effectively to repeated challenges. Think about learning any complex skill, whether it's speaking a new language, developing emotional resilience, improving physical fitness, or mastering a profession. The first stage often feels awkward. You make mistakes, you forget information, your performance feels inconsistent. From a psychological perspective, this can be discouraging, but from a neuroscience perspective, inconsistency is often evidence that learning is taking place. The brain is experimenting with new patterns before settling on the most efficient ones. An important concept here is that performance and learning are not always the same thing. Performance reflects what you can demonstrate in the present moment. Learning reflects the long-term changes occurring inside the nervous system. Sometimes your performance appears stagnant even while significant learning is taking place beneath the surface. This distinction is critical because many people mistakenly measure their potential based only on today's performance rather than the trajectory of ongoing adaptation. Another reason growth feels chaotic is because the brain temporarily becomes less efficient while integrating new information. Existing habits are automatic because they've been repeated thousands of times. New behaviors, however, require conscious attention from regions of the brain involved in planning, decision-making, and executive control. This increased mental effort can make you feel slower or less capable at first. But what you're actually experiencing is the cost of building a more sophisticated neural network. Stress also plays an important role in this process. It's helpful to distinguish between temporary, manageable stress and chronic, overwhelming stress. Moderate levels of challenge activate systems in the brain and body that enhance attention, motivation, and learning. They prepare you to adapt. However, if stress becomes constant without adequate recovery, these same systems begin to impair memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. The goal is not to eliminate stress entirely, but to experience periods of challenge followed by sufficient recovery, allowing the nervous system to consolidate what it has learned. Recovery is often underestimated because it appears passive. In reality, some of the most important biological processes involved in growth occur after the challenge has ended. During sleep, for example, the brain strengthens useful neural connections while eliminating less efficient ones. Memory becomes more stable, emotional experiences are processed, and the nervous system prepares itself for future learning. This is why consistent sleep, proper nutrition, movement, and moments of deliberate rest are not separate from personal growth. They are essential components of it. Resilience develops in much the same way. Many people think resilience means never experiencing fear, frustration, or disappointment. The science suggests something different. Resilience is the capacity to recover after difficulty. Every time you encounter a challenge, experience temporary discomfort, and successfully return to a stable emotional and physiological state, your brain becomes slightly better prepared for future challenges. Over time, these repeated cycles strengthen your ability to remain effective under pressure. This is one reason why individuals who have overcome significant obstacles often display remarkable emotional stability. It's not because they avoided hardship. It's because their nervous systems repeatedly practiced recovering from it. The brain learns that discomfort is temporary, that uncertainty can be tolerated, and that difficult experiences do not necessarily predict negative outcomes. These repeated experiences reshape how future stressors are interpreted. Another interesting feature of growth is that it often appears non-linear. You may work consistently for weeks with little noticeable improvement, then suddenly experience a breakthrough that feels almost effortless. This pattern is common because neural adaptation accumulates gradually until enough biological changes have occurred to produce a visible shift in behavior or performance. To an outside observer, the improvement appears sudden. In reality, it represents the accumulation of hundreds of small adaptations that occurred over an extended period. This understanding changes the way you interpret difficult seasons. Instead of asking, "Why aren't I seeing results?" a more productive question becomes, "What is my nervous system learning through this repeated experience?" That subtle shift encourages consistency rather than discouragement. It acknowledges that meaningful change is often taking place long before it becomes obvious. The people who eventually experience extraordinary transformation are rarely those who receive immediate rewards. More often, they are the individuals who continue showing up during the phase when progress feels invisible. They understand that biological adaptation operates on a different timeline than emotional satisfaction. They recognize that every disciplined action, every recovered setback, every repeated effort is gradually reshaping the brain into one that is more capable, more resilient, and better prepared for the opportunities that often appear only after the foundation has already been built. When people imagine life-changing success, they often picture one defining moment, a major opportunity, a breakthrough idea, or a sudden realization that changes everything overnight. While those moments certainly exist, neuroscience suggests that they are almost never the true starting point. What appears to be an overnight transformation is usually the visible outcome of hundreds of small decisions that have been shaping the brain for weeks, months, or even years. Long before your life changes on the outside, your nervous system has already been changing on the inside. The brain is constantly adapting to whatever you repeat. It doesn't evaluate whether a behavior is important based on your intentions or your goals. Instead, it evaluates importance through frequency. Every repeated action sends a signal that says, "This matters." As a result, the neural circuits responsible for that behavior become stronger and more efficient. This principle applies equally to productive habits and unproductive ones. If you repeatedly delay difficult tasks, the brain becomes more efficient at procrastination. If you consistently confront meaningful challenges, the brain becomes more efficient at persistence. One of the remarkable characteristics of the nervous system is its ability to automate behaviors that are practiced consistently. At first, any new behavior requires deliberate attention. You have to think about it, plan for it, and consciously choose it. This process relies heavily on areas of the brain involved in executive function and decision-making. Over time, however, repeated practice transfers much of that activity into more automatic neural systems. The behavior begins requiring less mental effort because the brain has learned to perform it efficiently. This explains why discipline often feels difficult in the beginning but becomes easier with repetition. The goal isn't to rely on willpower forever. The goal is to practice a behavior long enough that it becomes part of your default operating system. Every repetition strengthens the neural pathway responsible for that action. Eventually, the behavior no longer feels like something you force yourself to do. It simply becomes part of who you are. An important concept in behavioral neuroscience is that identity follows action more reliably than action follows identity. Many people wait until they feel confident before acting confidently. They wait until they feel motivated before beginning difficult work. But the brain doesn't typically operate in that sequence. Instead, repeated behaviors gradually reshape how you see yourself. Every time you complete a difficult workout, keep a promise to yourself, or remain calm under pressure, you provide your brain with evidence that this is the type of person you are becoming. This process may seem subtle, but over time it becomes extraordinarily powerful. Confidence is not simply an emotion that appears without reason. In many cases, confidence is the brain's prediction based on accumulated evidence from previous successful actions. When you've repeatedly demonstrated to yourself that you can tolerate discomfort, solve problems, and recover from setbacks, your nervous system begins expecting success instead of fearing failure. That expectation influences future behavior in meaningful ways. Environment also plays a critical role in shaping these daily decisions. The brain continuously responds to cues surrounding it. If your environment constantly presents distractions, unhealthy food, endless notifications, or reminders of old habits, maintaining positive behaviors requires significantly more cognitive effort. Conversely, when your environment supports your goals, desirable behaviors become easier to repeat. This is why even small adjustments, placing your phone in another room while working, preparing healthy meals in advance, organizing your workspace, or scheduling exercise at the same time each day, can have effects that extend far beyond the behavior itself. They reduce friction, allowing consistency to emerge naturally. Another factor that deserves attention is the role of immediate rewards. The brain's reward systems are highly responsive to instant gratification. Social media notifications, processed foods, impulsive purchases, and endless entertainment all provide rapid bursts of reward that require very little effort. While these experiences are not inherently harmful in moderation, constantly seeking immediate rewards can train the brain to avoid activities whose benefits arrive more slowly. Deep learning, physical training, meaningful relationships, and career development all require delayed gratification. The nervous system must repeatedly experience the satisfaction of completing valuable work before these longer-term rewards begin competing effectively with immediate pleasures. This is why consistency matters far more than intensity. A single day of extraordinary effort cannot compensate for months of inactivity. The brain responds most reliably to patterns that occur repeatedly. Even small actions, when performed consistently, produce measurable changes in neural circuitry. Reading a few pages every day, exercising for 30 minutes, practicing focused attention, sleeping on a regular schedule, or spending a few minutes reflecting on your goals may appear insignificant in isolation. But from the perspective of neuroplasticity, each repetition contributes to strengthening the circuits associated with those behaviors. Another important observation is that progress often becomes noticeable only after crossing a certain threshold. During the early stages, each repetition feels almost invisible. You don't immediately notice stronger concentration, greater emotional control, or increased resilience. But as neural pathways become increasingly efficient, the effects begin accumulating. Suddenly, you realize you're making better decisions without overthinking them. Stressful situations no longer produce the same emotional reactions. Challenges that once seemed overwhelming now feel manageable. These changes are rarely sudden in biological terms. They are the result of hundreds of consistent repetitions finally reaching a level where the improvements become visible. Patience is therefore not simply a personality trait. It is a practical strategy that aligns with how the brain actually changes. The nervous system does not reorganize itself overnight. It requires repeated exposure, focused attention, recovery, and time. People often underestimate what can happen in a year of consistent effort because they overestimate what can happen in a week. Yet nearly every lasting transformation follows the same underlying biological principles. Before the best chapter of your life becomes visible to everyone else, it is quietly being built through ordinary decisions that few people ever notice. Each time you choose discipline over distraction, growth over comfort, curiosity over fear, and consistency over temporary emotion, you are reshaping the architecture of your brain. Those daily choices accumulate, strengthening the neural systems that support resilience, confidence, emotional stability, and purposeful action. Eventually, what once felt like effort becomes your natural way of operating, and the life that once seemed distant becomes the predictable outcome of the person your repeated actions have gradually created. If this message changed the way you think about your current struggles, remember this: the best chapter of your life doesn't begin when everything becomes easy. It begins the moment you stop interpreting discomfort as failure and start recognizing it as the process of growth. Your brain is always adapting. The question is, what are you training it to become today? Thanks for watching Brain Upgrade. If you found this video valuable, subscribe, leave a comment about the lesson that resonated with you the most, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, keep upgrading your brain one decision at a time.